The opening line to the gospel reading that Deacon Larry proclaimed begins with the words, when Jesus had gone out, when Judas left the room being where he'd celebrated this most amazing meal with his friends, to explain to them or to help them understand how great God's love is for them. So my hope for the four of you, that you will realize how great God's love is for you, and you, of course, you, Victoria, how great God's love is. But there's two little words to go before that word about Judas leaving that says, darkness fell. That doesn't usually reassure us, does it, when darkness falls? When I was your age, I used to suffer from waking in the night and sleepwalking. And I'd be in my bedroom and I couldn't find my way. And I'd think, well, that's the wardrobe, that's the chest of drawers. The light switch isn't there. And so it is very scary when we're in the dark. It is very scary when we lose our way. But Jesus didn't deter from his way, even though one of those who had been so close to him and the other 11, so close, so intimate, that he was the one that was going to betray Jesus. And Jesus goes on to say, now will God be glorified. Well, glorified is one of those words that's kind of hard to describe. When I was hearing it, I was thinking fireworks, music, color, stars. It's what we can't quite pin down, but we know it's important. So when Jesus says God is glorified, he's saying when all is lost, or when it seems that all is lost, when we don't know where to turn, that's the very moment, and certainly in the life of Jesus, that was the very moment when he was going to be glorified. And the glory isn't like the England team returning from the World Cup in 1966. I'm not a footballer, but I do remember that date. Winning the World Cup, the country was ecstatic, so joyful. But it's not that kind of glory. It's triumph over evil. Triumph over evil. But he didn't triumph over evil by getting a bigger sword or a bigger bomb or a bigger, mightier army. He did the absolute opposite. He gave himself as he was, vulnerable and human. Vulnerable and human. And he offered himself completely to the Father because he trusted in the Father. So I hope that through your reception of Holy Communion, you will become closer and closer and deeper and more aware of how much that you are loved. And no matter what happens in the future, God is with you because God never abandoned us. That's why the disciples were upset. They thought he was going. He said, I'm going away. Well, who's going to take your place? We're going to be alone. But he said, I'm going to be with you. And he's with us in a very special way. And one of the ways he's with us is the way that you have been preparing for all these weeks and months. What's the way? He can be with us when we eat the holy bread. Absolutely right, Max. And that's what the four of you are going to do, aren't you? To eat the holy bread. Because what does food do for us when we're hungry? It satisfies us and it makes us strong, doesn't it? And so we get strong. The first reading that Mr. Pete read was all about the adventures of the early church. Remember, the same 12 men, they saw Jesus die and suffer, and they witnessed his resurrection, and it filled them with courage. It filled them with courage that they went on great journeys, even though they were frightening journeys, because it wasn't like going to Hobby or International and getting on a plane and arriving safely at a destination. It was treacherous to get into boats, to travel in those days. But they did it because they knew that God was with them. They knew that Jesus was with them. But we will suffer times of hardship. We will suffer times of darkness. And I know people here from being amongst you so long that you have suffered and perhaps are suffering at times. Great moments of darkness. For me, when I was a young priest, I was 32, and I had a year that was a very hard year for me. First of all, a friend of mine was diagnosed with AIDS, and that was back in 1982. And so that was a terrible, terrible time. But he was very faithful. And actually, he loved Jesus. I went to see Paul one night. I've mentioned this before. I went to see him, 50-mile journey. And I said, I'm coming into town. I'll bring you communion, and then I'll go on to see John. I got to him, and I thought, I forgot communion. So I said, don't worry, I'll go to John. He was a chaplain at the university. I'll ask him for the host, and I'll bring it to you. And Paul was waiting. He was struggling. He was getting close to death, but he knew that he wanted to be fed on his Lord and Savior. And so as soon as I learned that Paul was so ill, I got news literally within days that my sister, 1 year older than me, suddenly died. So that was, darkness certainly fell on my world. But there's always the light of hope. There's always the hope of life of hope. And that's the glory that Jesus showed his disciples. It wasn't an earthly glory, with tanks and guns and people coming out fighting. It was total submission to what is true, total response to God's love. So my hope that the commandment that Jesus gave them when he was about to go into the garden and sweat blood, when he was about to be arrested, when he was about to die on the cross, he gave them a new commandment. At that very time when it was the darkest moment, you remember from the reading that Deacon Larry just read what the new commandment was? 3 words, to anybody. To love one another. And so, just as the bread and wine are transformed, so we are transformed to become loving, not vengeful, forgiving, not seeking retribution, trusting totally and utterly in a God who came and a God who stayed. Please like, subscribe, or comment below.